friends, it's Jess. Welcome to Salem. Today I'm doing a video that has been requested by a lot of you. We're going to be learning how to clean, repair, and store an antique quilt. Let's get started. As a lot of you I know have been finding quilts while you were going through your houses and spring cleaning during lockdown, this is a request that I've gotten a lot. So today I'm going to show you how to take care of a quilt so that it lasts a little bit longer. I have a quilt that was due for repair and I've been hanging on to it since May while I finished the last one with all of the plaid diamonds. And I think it's going to serve as a good demonstration for the techniques I'm going to be using today. Now, this video is in no way sponsored and I'm not using any affiliate links, but I do want to show you the soap I'm going to be using today. It's called Orvis Quilt Soap. Orvis Quilt Soap, it's designed for antique quilts and laces and silks and materials. You can use this on everything from antique lace to wedding dresses to quilts. The quilt that I'm going to be working on today I've had for several months and it's due for repairs, but before I start repairing it, it really needs a good wash. However, it is very delicate in some places. As you can see, it's been patched a couple of times already, but the cotton fabric used for the triangles on the front is pretty thin, so I'm not going to be able to run this through my washing machine. And if you have an antique quilt at home, you probably shouldn't run yours through the washing machine either. Washing machines with agitators in them can be murder on your quilts, so I don't recommend using a washing machine unless you have a front load washer or a top load washer without an agitator. And even then, take into consideration first how delicate the quilt is. It might be better to use a tub soak like we're going to do today. I've gone ahead and given my tub a thorough cleaning to make sure that there isn't any residue that would potentially harm the quilt. I've also rinsed it out very thoroughly to make sure that there isn't any harsh chemicals from the soap that I use to clean my tub. I'm going to be using cool water to clean the quilt because even though you think hot water would probably do a better job of cleaning the quilt, hot water can make the colors bleed and really disintegrate any fabrics that are already on their final threads. So we're going to be very, very gentle with the quilt we're cleaning today. I've gone ahead and added some lukewarm water to the tub because it was very, very cold. And I've tried to dissolve the soap paste as best as I could, and I trust that it'll dissolve more as it sits in there. But I have the quilt now, and I'm just going to gently place it in the tub. And try and get it as spread out as possible. It's going to get very heavy the wetter it gets. And you just want to work it slowly, just sort of agitate it in the water, be very gentle, especially if you have some fabrics that are starting to really wear away. And it's probably going to want to float some, but try and submerge it as much as possible. Ooh, my hands are cold. Okay, quilt check. So I've had this soaking for 30-45 minutes, and as you can see, the water is disgusting, which is great because that means that this is working. So I'm going to sort of flip it around and massage it a little bit more and work the water into the places where it may be sticking out, and just sort of turn the quilt and let it soak for a little bit longer. And then we will wring it out and rinse it and see how it looks. Ew, that's so gross. Can you see how dirty that water is? Oof. I might actually want to wash this a second time. We'll see how it looks once I'm done with this first soak. So I'm just wringing the water out by squishing it against the side of the tub. And get as much out as possible before that second soak. Get all the junk out of there. Fortunately, this quilt is small enough that I can hang it on my drying rack in the bathtub, so anything that I wasn't able to squish out can drip overnight. If you wanted to, you could hang your quilt out on a wash line. Right now it's February though, so it would freeze solid overnight. Hang it over maybe some chairs in your dining room or something else. So I'm gonna just try and spread this out as best I can. It's very delicate. And then once it's fully dry, we can work on the repair part of the job. Alright, so this quilt has been washed. It is hanging to drip dry. If you ever do need to dry a quilt, take a good look at what fabrics it's made of first. If it's cotton, wool, linen, any kind of natural fibers, it's very likely to shrink up in the dryer. And especially when I'm working on an antique quilt, I don't have any sense of, where the fabric's pre-washed or not, so obviously you want to be very careful if you're putting a quilt in the dryer. So we'll let this drip dry overnight and then I'll check on it in the morning. Good night, everybody. It is the next morning and the quilt dried out fairly well overnight. So as you can see, a lot of the deeper stains did not come out. We do still have some brown in places. It's hard to tell what that might have been. I'm going to do some research on quilt stains later today and see if there's a way to get some of those out. But if you look at the rest of the colors and some of the other whites in the quilt, the Orvis did do a good job of brightening it up. The majority of the quilt that was hanging at the top of the rack is dry. The bottom parts are still kind of damp. So I'm going to be moving this drying rack out into a more open area under one of my ceiling fans so it can finish drying today and so that I can get a shower. The quilt is dry. I let it dry out for probably a full 24 hours. The parts that took the longest to dry were the corners because the fabric was extra thick there. But I would say all in all, a very successful tub soak and air dry. The quilt is much brighter now than it was. However, some of the stains are still there. One method that you can use to get rid of brown hard water stains is to use something very acidic like a white vinegar or a lemon juice and to just very gently rub it into that spot and try to lift the stain out. But I have decided to leave these stains alone and to not use anything with a very harsh pH on the quilt, and I'm going to tell you why. So as we all know, deja vu is not uncommon. However, I've never gotten deja vu with a quilt before. As I was soaking this quilt in the tub and getting a closer look at some of the fabrics used, a few of them looked familiar to me, and I thought maybe I was crazy at first, so I did a little bit of Googling to confirm my suspicions, and I have in fact seen some of these fabrics before. In particular, I have worked with these reds and greens before. So there's this really pretty green floral pattern that's used throughout the quilt. And there's also a red-pink floral that is very common. So the place where I've seen those colors and those fabrics used before was on a quilt I repaired about 2 years ago, and that one we actually could track how old it was and who made it because there was documentation passed down through the family. And that quilt was made in Lancaster County in 1877. I know what you're thinking. It's a crazy old quilt, right? I like nearly had a heart attack working on it. Just the weight of, oh my goodness, what if I screw up? But apparently these greens and reds were very common for quilts post-Civil War era in the 1870s and 1880s. And that confused me for a little bit at first when I was working on this quilt, because my client told me that family suspicion, at least, is that her grandmother made it. Now, her grandmother passed away just a couple of years ago, so there's no way that her grandmother was alive 150 years ago when I suspect this quilt top was put together. If you take a closer look at the binding and the backing on the quilt, just from touch, I can tell that it's a very rough polyester. Polyester fabric did not become commonplace until after the 1950s. And so what I suspect the history of this quilt is, now this is just an educated guess, I'm by no means a quilt appraiser or a quilt historian, I just sort of dabble. But I would suspect that the quilt top was made sometime during the 1870s or 1880s. It was either passed down through the family and unfinished, or perhaps was picked up at an estate sale or given to my client's grandmother by a friend. And that grandmother then, sometime after the 1950s, decided to finish it and put a backing on it. The backing is not as neatly assembled as some that I've seen. It's got just this double line, double straight stitch, machine stitch, the whole way around the edge. And so it was clearly, to me, just a preservation tactic to sort of keep the quilt top intact. Another reason I believe that is that the quilt, I'm not sure if you can call it a quilt, but the top of the quilt has not been quilted or knotted onto the backing. The person who had taken the time and care to hand stitch all of these triangles together, because it is just a hand stitched running stitch through each of these seams, they would have taken the time to, to properly put this together and to quilt it. So I don't believe that my client's grandmother was the one who created the quilt top. Another really neat indication that of the quilt's age can be found in the plaid brown squares along this side of the quilt that have started to tear apart. The quilt that I worked on from 1877 also had this problem, and I took that quilt to a licensed appraiser for her opinion on it before I started any repairs. Which is something that I really recommend doing, especially if you're interested in selling the quilt or auctioning it off, because sometimes a very old quilt or a very historic quilt is worth more even in its damaged state than it is if you do repairs to it first before you sell it. So if you have any ambitions of selling your quilt, definitely do go ahead and get it appraised. But anyways, the appraiser that I was talking to, her name is Jane, she lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, told me that iron was used as a mordant in brown dyes of that period. Because the quilt that I had been working on from 1877 had an orange and brown stripe on the backing fabric, and the fabric was ripping in perfect stripes in line with the stripes on the fabric, which just seemed very bizarre to me. But the reason for it is the iron that was used as in mordant in these dyes. So you can see that these brown plaid squares are having the same issue where they are tearing right along these very tiny dark brown lines. And that is because the iron used as the mordant in the dye is literally rusting after all of this time. And so it is rusting along the lines of this dye, which is causing the fabric to rip in perfect straight lines. So based on all those indicators, the fabrics that are used, the way that the quilt has deteriorated over time, that's why I think that this quilt is really quite old, and that's why I'm not going to be attacking those brown stains anymore. So another indicator is that a number of these triangles have been pieced, which is also a hallmark for the period, because they took advantage of whatever fabrics they had, right? They used scraps and put things together that way. Waste not, want not. I have an example of that piecing here, and another one of these white squares, and there's a couple other, well, white triangles, another one of these white triangles, and there's a couple other examples throughout the quilt. There were also a number of seams that popped open even during the tub soak that I did on the quilt. And once again, given the age of the quilt top, I don't feel too bad about that, and these are going to be a very easy fix. I'll just go through with a slip stitch and put those back together. Knowing the age of your quilt and knowing as much about the quilt as you can is very helpful in the restoration process, because the age of this quilt is also informing to me about how I want to go about fixing it. So the popped seams are an easy fix. I can just go through and stitch those closed. But as far as those brown plaid patches that have absolutely shredded, I don't want to replace them because the fabric is still original and it is very old. I think the best thing to do here is to patch over it. Whenever you're restoring a quilt, or I should say, actually, there's a difference between restoration and conservation. So what I'm doing with this quilt is not restoration, it is conservation. When you are restoring a quilt, you are trying to return it to its original state. So that could mean replacing patches, or fixing the seam work and trying to get it as close to the original as possible. Conservation work is more about protecting what's already there. And when you're working with a very old quilt, you want to protect the value of it. You don't really want to change anything original about it. And you don't want to do any work to the quilts that can't be undone. So that is why I'm leaving the shredded patches, but I'm going to put new protective patches over top of them in a very similar material, because that way you preserve the history of the quilt while also returning it to a more usable state. Sometimes you might not have the type of fabric that you would want to use to patch over a quilt, or as I've seen on some quilts, the damage is far too extensive to even start patching it, because there's no fabric sturdy enough or even left to put a patch onto. And so what I've seen in some of those circumstances is they'll take a translucent tulle or some other sort of mesh fabric and very carefully tack it down on top of what remains of the quilt. That way there's a protective layer, but you can still see the original quilt underneath. So the next step for this quilt, now that it has been washed and dried, I'm going to go just seam by seam the whole way across the quilt and make sure that I catch all of those popped seams, reinforce ones that are looking loose with some hand stitching, and then I will be looking through my scrap box to find some patches to place over top of the brown plaid that you see here. I've gone ahead through my fabric stash and picked out a brown plaid that I'm going to use to patch over the most damaged and threadbare areas. It's not a perfect match, but it's not meant to replace the squares, it's just a protective patch to go over the original work. So I'm going to use that on the worst areas of the quilt, and then just go through and reinforce whatever seams have popped to keep those from ripping any further, and then this repair will be finished. I want to talk a little bit about quilt storage. So when you are storing an antique quilt, you want to not do what a lot of conventional storage methods would tell you to do. You don't want to place it in any kind of wooden drawers or even a cedar chest. Cedar chips are told to keep away things like pests and moths and other critters that would chew holes in your quilt, but the tannins that naturally occur in the wood can stain your fabric over time. If you do have to store your quilt in a drawer, wrap a protective sheet or a pillowcase around it first. Similarly, you don't want to store your quilt in anything plastic, so any zipper liners or garment bags or plastic tubs. those can trap in moisture and it could cause your quilt to mildew or mold, and that could also destroy it over time. What you want to do is get away from folding your quilt if possible. Roll it instead, because those creases can really embed themselves in your quilt over time, and the longer they're there, they can actually turn into rips and tears. Put it in a pillowcase, store it on a shelf somewhere out of the way of children or pets, and make sure that it is in a dry, cool area. You don't want any moisture or humidity or heat that could potentially damage the fabric. If you are going to put it on display, make sure that it's also not in a place that it's going to be exposed to a lot of UV radiation. So not in the path of direct sunlight or somewhere that the fabric and colors are going to fade over time. Because in addition to fading the colors, UV radiation can also disintegrate your fabrics. Anyways, thanks for joining me today while I worked on this antique quilt. I hope that you learned something about how to clean and store quilts, and that you're able to take this knowledge and use it to save some quilts of your own for future generations to enjoy. If you have any more questions about quilt repair, cleaning, and storage, feel free to stick them in the comments below. I'll answer as many as I can or direct you towards some other resources. And as always, like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you back here soon at Salem for our next adventure. Bye!